Accordingly, the question is as follows, that this House do adjourn.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to rise tonight in adjournment debate to pursue a question that I asked in question period back in October 2023. On October 7th, I asked about October 6th, I asked about the delays of the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the decision of our Crown Corporation, us, our government, all Canadians, to violate a, I believe, sacred commitment that we'd made to the First Nations at Tlaloc First Nation. They often go by the initials S and S, First Nation. They're near Kamloops, and they have a sacred area of their territory that they call the Pípsell. I know this area well because I worked with that First Nation when they conducted their own independent environmental assessment of a proposed open mine that was to be run. It was called the Ajax Mine. The reason that the First Nation turned down the Ajax Mine was that it would violate the sacred nature of the Pípsell and that it must be protected. When that same First Nation negotiated with our Crown Corporation, Trans Mountain Expansion, TMX, about bringing a pipeline through their territory, they agreed, but on a strong condition, if and only if the Pípsell was protected. And TMX said they had engineers, they could do micro-tunneling, they could drill around the Pípsell, they would not disturb the Pípsell. That was just up until this fall, when TMX discovered their engineering wasn't so good. They discovered they couldn't micro-tunnel. They went back to the energy regulator, Canada Energy Regulator, and said, we can't keep our word to this First Nation. We're going to have to drill right through the Pípsell. The First Nation went to the Canadian Environmental Regulator and made the case that it shouldn't be allowed. The Canadian Energy Regulator said, so sad, it looks like if we don't violate our commitments to you, in other words, if we don't violate the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that free, prior, and informed consent means something, then the cost of the pipeline will go up again, and there will be further delays again, and the pipeline must be built. Why? It's now an article of faith of this government that the pipeline must be built. They don't need evidence, and there isn't evidence in favor of building that pipeline. There's never been a cost-benefit analysis on building that pipeline, and I know because I went through the National Energy Board hearings at the initial process. Well, it gets worse, Madam Speaker, because not only did the Canadian Energy Regulator give them permission to proceed, as I pointed out in my question in October, the Canadian Energy Regulator didn't give reasons for their decision, so the First Nation was unable to put together a case to go to court to get an injunction against the construction, and they decided to start building on the very day that was the statutory holiday in Canada to mark Reconciliation Day, the Day for Truth and Reconciliation. The answer I got from the Parliamentary Secretary at the time was that decision was made by an independent regulator. I knew that. I didn't ask the Government of Canada why it made the decision to ignore the sacred nature of the commitment. I asked why our government didn't tell TMX, which we own, to stop construction until they gave the First Nation the legal reasons on which they could base an appeal. It's continued to get bad, Madam Speaker. Predictably, the pipeline is delayed again. The costs are now $35 billion. When will we stop the madness and cancel the pipeline?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Reconciliation with Native communities is a priority for our government. We want to work with First Nations across Canada. We need a national plan to share, to make sure that Indigenous communities are with us as partners in our major projects, so that they can attain and share in Canada's economic prosperity. and this through a clean economy. And there are new means of going forward with economic reconciliation. Economic reconciliation, whether this has to do with the engagement of Indigenous partners, the assurance that Indigenous communities are sharing in these major projects to create a strong, sustainable economy. Natural Resources Canada has received over $130 million to work on economic reconciliation in the natural resources sector. To come up with a national framework, the Government of Canada has committed to renew its relationships with Indigenous peoples on a basis of respect and partnership. As we know, the world is dealing with the impact of climate change, and we must invest in solutions to reduce emissions that harm our economy. That's why we need clean, renewable forms of energy, and we need to create jobs, and this with Indigenous partners. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
To say that this was an inadequate response would be a massive understatement. The parliamentary secretary just told us we have to reduce emissions while defending building a $35 billion pipeline that will increase emissions. It's a climate disaster. And he completely ignored, as this government did before, that the pipeline violating the Pípsell is the equivalent, as I said on October 6th, of a decision to destroy the Garden of Eden if we knew where it was for people from the Judeo-Christian tradition. This is the origin story of the peoples of this territory, and there aren't enough beads and trinkets to throw into the mix to make up for the violation and the absolute obscenity of doing it on the day, the statutory holiday for reconciliation.
The Honourable Secretary Parliament.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Of dollars in partnership with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. I'll give you some examples, Madame la Présidente. The Old Crow Solar Project in Yukon with the First Nations of Wonton, Gwich'in. Also, the Birch Wind Farm in New Brunswick with the Tobic First Nations. Also, Oneida Energy Storage Project with the Six Nations in Ontario is another example. The Picawar Wind Project and the Awasis Solar Project, and with the Kawas S First Nations in Saskatchewan. These are examples of investments we made with First Nations. I could name many more, Madam Speaker, but these projects are just in ways that we're partnering with Indigenous leaders to deliver energy security, clean power, and emission reductions. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.